Welcome to the History 30 lecture on the rise of New France. Canada to stay. It did not take the French long to realize that there was wealth to be gained from the lands that had blocked their attempts to find a passage to the east. Fish was the initial resource the French had exploited. Fur was the second. But not until 1600 was the first organized attempt made to formalize a trade in furs. The French king granted monopolies on trade to various private companies in return for promises that they would settle colonists in what he viewed as his domains, thus enhancing claims to them. Champlain and New France. On July 3, 1608, Champlain selected Quebec as a site for French settlement. This marked the beginning of the French occupation that came to be known as New France. In June 1606, Champlain agreed to help the Huron, Algonquin, and Montaignais in their ongoing battle against the Iroquois. As a result of the French alliance, the Huron and their allies were able to defeat the Iroquois in a pitched battle, largely due to the use of Champlain and his men and their firearms. This resulted in the Iroquois becoming the most deadly enemies of the French for almost a century thereafter, until 1701, when a peace treaty was finally signed. New France and the fur trade. The colony grew and the fur trade prospered. Champlain increased trade with the Huron and expanded the fur trade up the Ottawa River and down to Lake Huron. The coureurs de bois, or the runners of the woods, played an important role in Champlain's drive to chart the geography of the fur trade. They were also essential in bridging the culture gap between Native and Canadian societies. Missionaries. Recollet missionaries were brought to the colony in 1615, as Champlain thought that perhaps converting the Iroquois would make the settlers safer. In 1625, the Jesuits were invited and proved to be very active in their attempts at conversion. The Recollets were not active enough in converting the Iroquois, therefore the Jesuits were sent. Jesuits. Jesuit explorations in search of souls brought vast tracts of land into European knowledge. French believed that by converting the natives to Christianity, the natives would be less inclined to attack French settlements. They built missions at strategic points between Lakes Ontario and Huron. The most famous of the Jesuit missions was the Ste. Marie Mission, built at the mouth of the Wye River in 1639. From this point, missionaries could reach many of the Huron. The mission had to be burned in 1649 to prevent its desecration by attacking Iroquois, who in that year carried out their long-planned annihilation of their Huron enemies. The once proud Huron nation, already weakened by smallpox and other European diseases, were decimated by their enemies and trade competitors, the Iroquois. The fury of the Iroquois was also turned on many of the Jesuit missionaries, who suffered terrible, tortured deaths at their hands. In 1627, Cardinal Richelieu created the Cent Associés, or 100 Associates. The Kirke family from Scotland defeated the Champlain and the French in 1628. Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was signed March 20, 1632. The Cent Associés were sent to promote French trade and colonial expansion overseas. In New France, this became the Compagnie de la Nouvelle France, with vast monopolistic powers. The company planned to send out 4,000 new colonists in the next 4 years, but this was cut short by a war between England and France. The treaty provided for the return of Quebec to the French. The French king agreed to pay an unpaid debt to the English. Acadia. Port Royal was the main habitation in Acadia, but was abandoned in 1607 when Pierre de Monts lost his trade monopoly. De Monts returned his attention to the colony that is now Quebec City, but not everyone believed Acadia was a lost cause. In 1610, the Poutrincourt, one of the Monts Associates, sailed back to Port Royal to start anew. The Micmac had maintained the Port Royal habitation and garden in good repair during their absence. The Micmac played an important role in the success of the early Acadian settlements, as they gave their support and help to the French. More importantly, they didn't launch the type of attacks against the Acadians that the Iroquois did against the settlers of New France. In 1660, New France had a population of about 3,000. The English colonies on the eastern seaboard had a population of 100,000 or more. King Louis XIV, on the advice of his advisor Jean-Baptiste Colbert, cancelled the Company of 100 Associates and elevated New France to the position of royal province. The Company of 100 had actually sublet its monopoly to a third party by this point, so cancelling it was more of an act of enthusiasm than anything. Rule by royal decree was a drastic measure, but it worked. Within 10 years, the colony had more than doubled its size. Based on the idea that trade is a zero-sum game and that wealth is finite, is what is behind mercantilism. Major trade nations were convinced that they had to sell more goods than they purchased in order to thrive. Colonies were meant to be exploited. The pie can only be cut so many ways, and more for you means less for me. Ideally, colonies should not cost more to administer than the value of the goods they supplied. The object of trade under mercantilism was not to increase the standard of living or improve infrastructure. The point was to amass as much wealth as possible, usually at the expense of other nations. Triangular trade was developed as a system of self-support between France and its colonies in Canada and the Caribbean. Canadian colonies would ship furs, fish, timber, and minerals. The Caribbean colonies would supply rum, molasses, and sugar. France would supply textiles and manufactured goods. This was developed by Jean-Baptiste Colbert. It put New France in a key cornerstone position. No longer a colonial backwater, it was now considered a vital player in the grand imperial scheme. A new position was created to manage these affairs, that of colonial administrator or intendant. Jean Talon, the first intendant of New France, arrived in 1665 and immediately began transforming the place from a struggling fur-trading colony into a robust royal province. He built the first shipyard, imported livestock, established new committees, created family allowance, introduced the idea that landowners should reside on the land they owned. Talon was a catalyst to impressive growth in New France. He encouraged many shops, inns, and factories to set up. By the time he left in 1672, Talon had helped launch remarkable transformation. More importantly, he had arranged for hundreds of young women to immigrate to New France. 1665 was a turning point in the history of New France. This year saw the arrival of 1,100 French soldiers of the elite Carignan-Salieres Regiment. Their mission was to end the Iroquois threat once and for all. They set up a visible garrison duty at Montreal and Trois-Rivières. They never fought a major battle with the Iroquois in the 3 years they were there. In 1667, the Iroquois agreed to a ceasefire. The presence of the regiment acted as a deterrent. The peace would last 20 years, during which time New France would flourish. Cathedrals and grand homes were built, land was cleared, farms were established, and high society soirees were held in banquet halls and manorial residences. The regiment returned to France after the peace treaty was signed, but 400 soldiers and officers stayed behind and were granted vast tracts of land by Talon. Between 1663 and 1673, under Talon's urging, Louis XIV sponsored nearly 800 young female settlers. These women were called the Filles du Roi, daughters of the king, and their transportation and settlement costs were covered by the king. This sparked a population explosion that saved New France just as sure as the regiment had. Many of the Filles du Roi were orphans, most of modest birth. Some, secretly, were widows escaping poverty. Many were young women looking for a better life in the New World. The filles du roi from noble backgrounds usually married the officers of the Carignan Sallier regiment. The women chose their own husbands, but not all of the men were eager to get married and settle down. Some of them were actually hostile to the idea and often refused to take a wife. Talon would not tolerate this and took harsh measures to force the men to choose a bride. The seigneurial system. Based on European concepts of feudalism and land ownership, the Crown granted land titles to certain deserving individuals and institutions, usually soldiers and noblemen or religious organizations. In Canada, they could be wealthy or well-connected commoners. An estate belonged to a seigneur or lord on the condition that he develop it, built a manor, a mill, and even a fortress. To achieve this, the seigneur brought in laborers who lived on his land and worked it. Although these tenants, known as habitants in Canada, did not fully own the land they worked, they could pass it on to their children, making them owners in effect, if not fact. The habitants paid a lease and had certain obligations to the lords of the estate, such as giving him a portion of their harvest. In Canada, unlike Europe, seigneurs often worked alongside their tenants, which helped to blunt social barriers. Despite power being wrestled away from the church and focused on the governor and intendant, the colony retained a strong theological element. Marie de l'Incarnation and Bishop Laval were two of the most influential religious leaders in the early years of New France. Marie was a widow from Tours, France, who had abandoned her young son and entered the secluded world of the Ursulines, a religious order for women. She later sailed for Canada, arriving in Quebec in 1639. She established a convent and worked hard, educating young women and translating religious texts into native languages. Bishop Laval was a Jesuit bishop who arrived in Quebec in 1659 and quickly asserted his authority. Laval fought long and hard against the ongoing liquor trade with the First Nations. He built numerous churches, and in 1663 he founded Canada's first college, the Theological Séminaire de Québec. The Canadiens. By 1700, a new nationality was taking shape, one that saw itself as neither French nor European, but Canadien. Canadiens had far more freedoms than their European counterparts. They ate better, had a healthier lifestyle and bigger families, and were not nearly as deferential to authority. Officials from France were already complaining that the habitants of Canada were too proud.